In the mist-shrouded streets of early 17th century Paris, along the narrow Rue Saint-Jean-de-Latran, where the city's outcasts made their homes, the Sanson family's remarkable journey into France's most feared and reviled profession began not with ambition, but with a twist of fate that would forever alter their destiny. The streets they walked were the same ones where, years later, novelist Victor Hugo would find inspiration for his dark tales, writing in The Last Day of a Condemned Man. The executioner, that word stands alone, a fearsome word that contains within it an entire system of terror. The story begins in 1675, when Charles Sanson, a young nobleman from Abbeville in Picardy, found himself stripped of his privileged status after his father's involvement in a political scandal supporting the Fronde rebellion against young King Louis XIV. With his family's fortunes in ruins, Charles faced an impossible choice when he fell in love with Marguerite Jouenne, the daughter of Rouen executioner. Their courtship took place in secret meetings near the Saint-Ouen Abbey, where they could avoid the watchful eyes of society. In that era, marrying into an executioner's family meant automatically inheriting the profession, a role that, once accepted, would mark not only the individual, but generations to come. As contemporary chronicler Jean-Baptiste de Saint-Victor noted, to touch the executioner was to become the executioner. The position of executioner in pre-revolutionary France existed in a peculiar social limbo. While it offered financial security through regular wages and additional fees for each execution, ranging from 5 livres for a simple hanging to 30 livres for breaking on the wheel, it came with an almost unbearable social burden. Executioners were forbidden from living within city walls. The Sanson family's first Paris residence was located near the notorious Montfaucon gibbet, where the decomposing bodies of criminals were displayed. They were required to wear distinctive red or yellow clothing or marks identifying their profession, and were barred from entering taverns or touching food in markets. A famous incident in 1696 saw Charles Sanson's wife being pelted with rotten vegetables when she attempted to purchase bread from a local baker, leading to a royal decree that specifically protected executioners' families from such harassment. Despite these harsh conditions, Charles Sanson's acceptance of the role marked the beginning of what would become France's most notorious executioner dynasty. By 1688, he had secured the position of Paris's executioner, following the retirement of Nicolas Levasseur, whose family had held the position for 3 generations. The Paris position came with unique privileges: a substantial salary of 3,600 livres annually, equivalent to roughly $150,000 today, free housing near the Pillory of the Halles at 9 Rue des Cordeliers, and the right to collect additional fees for various punishments carried out. Their house, which still stood until the 19th century renovations of Paris, was described by contemporary writer Restif de la Bretonne as a sombre building with high walls and few windows, more resembling a prison than a home. The Sansons' rise to prominence coincided with significant changes in French justice under Louis XIV's reign, when public executions became increasingly choreographed spectacles of state power. In 1721, at the Place de Grève, Charles Jean-Baptiste Sanson executed the notorious cartomancer and poisoner, La Voisin, in a spectacle that drew over 30,000 spectators. The family adapted to these changes, developing a reputation for professionalism and efficiency that set them apart from their contemporaries. Charles Jean-Baptiste Sanson, who inherited the position in 1726, notably introduced more humane execution methods and insisted on quick, clean deaths when possible, an unusual consideration for the time. He was known to practice his technique on sheep and calves, leading to the development of the Parisian drop method of hanging, which caused near-instant death by breaking the condemned's neck. Perhaps the most fascinating aspect of the Sansons' early years was their dual existence. While officially shunned, they maintained secret connections with Paris's elite, including the renowned surgeon Georges Maréchal, who would occasionally seek their expertise in anatomy. Their knowledge of anatomy, gained through their grim work made them unofficial consultants to medical students and surgeons at the nearby Faculty of Medicine. The family's private library, inventoried in 1737, contained 54 medical texts alongside execution manuals and philosophical works, including rare anatomical studies by Vesalius. They were known to host clandestine anatomy lessons in their cellar, attended by medical students who would arrive under cover of darkness. The stigma of their profession manifested in peculiar ways. When Charles-Henri Sanson, the most famous family member, attended the Collège des Grassins in 1753 at age 14, he used the alias Charles-Henri Longueval to hide his identity. However, when a fellow student recognized him as the executioner's son after spotting him entering his father's house, he was expelled, not for being an executioner's son, but for having deceived the school about his background. This incident illustrates the complex web of social codes that governed their existence. The school's headmaster reportedly told him, "Monsieur, your father kills legally, but you have murdered truth." The Sansons developed various coping mechanisms to deal with their social isolation. At their residence near the Cimetière des Innocents, they created extensive gardens spanning nearly an acre, growing their own food to avoid the humiliation of market restrictions. Their garden became particularly known for its medicinal herbs, which they used to treat the wounds of those subjected to non-lethal punishments. Gabriel Sanson, Charles-Henri's uncle, was particularly skilled in herbalism and developed a salve used to prevent infection in branded criminals. They established their own social circles with other executioner families, creating a parallel society with its own customs and traditions. The marriage register of Saint-Laurent Church from 1726 to 1778 shows that out of 23 marriages involving executioner families in Paris, 19 were between children of different executioner dynasties, including the prominent Hector family of Rouen and the Ferrets of Dijon. Their status as royal executioners granted them certain unique privileges that partially offset their social exclusion. A royal edict of 1707 explicitly confirmed their tax-exempt status, noting their essential service to the crown. They could carry weapons within city limits, a significant privilege in an era when weapon possession was strictly regulated, and had the right to claim the belongings of executed criminals. This latter right led to some macabre commerce. In 1734, Charles Jean-Baptiste Sanson sold the clothes of executed nobleman Antoine-François Deschamps for 120 livres to a theatrical costume maker. They also received havage, the right to take a portion of goods from merchants in the markets without payment, typically every Wednesday and Saturday. By 1750, this privilege was typically commuted to a payment of 300 livres annually from the Merchants' Guild, documented in the Guild's ledgers preserved in the Archives Nationales. The family's professional duties extended far beyond mere executions. In 1692, Charles Sanson was called upon to examine the bodies of 13 suspected plague victims, demonstrating their role in public health matters. They were responsible for carrying out all forms of corporal punishment, from branding, marking criminals with the fleur-de-lis using a heated iron, to breaking on the wheel, a particularly gruesome punishment that could take hours and required considerable anatomical knowledge to perform correctly. A surviving manual, in Charles-Henri's handwriting, details 178 different types of punishments and their proper execution, including precise measurements for rope lengths in hanging and optimal angles for sword blows in decapitations. By the mid-18th century, the Sanson family had transformed the position of executioner from a reviled necessity to a quasi-professional office. Charles-Henri Sanson maintained a detailed journal preserved in the Bibliothèque Nationale, recording 2,918 executions over his career, with notations about the condemned's behavior and the effectiveness of various execution methods. The family even corresponded with anatomists and physicians like Dr. Antoine Louis about more humane execution methods, leading to early discussions about what would eventually become the guillotine. A letter from 1757 shows Charles-Henri arguing against the continued use of breaking on the wheel, calling it an affront to human dignity and an unnecessary prolonging of suffering. The Sanson family's influence extended into unexpected areas of French society. They were often consulted on legal matters involving torture and execution, with courts seeking their expertise on whether certain punishments were survivable. In 1771, Charles Henri testified in a famous case involving a man who survived hanging, arguing successfully that survival of the punishment should be considered divine intervention and result in a pardon, a position that became legal precedent. As unofficial crime scene investigators, they kept detailed records of wound patterns and death characteristics, creating what some historians consider one of the earliest forms of forensic documentation. By the eve of the French Revolution, the Sansons had executed over 9,000 people in Paris alone, according to municipal records. Their presence had become so institutionalized that they received official invitations to certain court functions, though they were required to enter through separate doors and remain in designated areas. The famous diarist Louis-Sébastien Mercier wrote in his Tableau de Paris, "The executioner walks among us like death itself, feared by all, yet essential to the machinery of justice." This paradoxical existence, being both essential and outcast, would reach its climax during the Revolution, when Charles-Henri Sanson would face his most challenging test, the execution of King Louis XVI. But that's another chapter in their extraordinary story, one that would further cement their place in French history and demonstrate how a family could maintain dignity and professionalism even while carrying out history's most controversial executions. The Sanson family's entrance into and rise within the execution profession illuminates a fascinating paradox of pre-revolutionary French society, captured perfectly by philosopher Denis Diderot, who wrote in 1765, "The executioner is both the pillar of society and its greatest shame, needed by all, welcomed by none." The science behind the guillotine, the secrets of the Sanson executioners. In the pre-dawn hours of Paris, while the city still slept, Charles-Henri Sanson and his son Henri would begin their meticulous preparation ritual at precisely 4:30 a.m., a process documented in Charles Henri's Journal des Exécutions that would become even more crucial during the frenzied days of the Revolution. The guillotine, standing 14 feet tall with its ominous blade weighing 88 pounds, was housed in a dedicated workshop at 3 Rue de la Ferronnerie, just steps away from where Henry IV had been assassinated in 1610. Dr. Joseph Ignace Guillotine, who first proposed the machine to the National Assembly in 1789, would often visit the workshop to suggest improvements, though he later came to regret his association with the device so much that his family changed their surname. The Sansons' day would begin at their workshop near the Place de Grève, renamed Place de la Révolution in 1792 and now known as Place de la Concorde, where they maintained their instruments with an almost religious dedication. The primary blade, forged from high-quality steel by the renowned metalsmith Tobias Schmidt at his workshop on Rue de la Harpe, cost 960 livres, nearly half a year's wage for a skilled craftsman. Schmidt, a German harpsichord maker turned guillotine manufacturer, would produce over 20 blades for the Sansons between 1792 and 1795, each marked with a distinctive maker's mark and serial number. Charles Henri's detailed notebooks reveal the painstaking process. The blade was sharpened at a precise 45-degree angle, tested on straw-filled sacks and dead sheep to ensure a clean cut. An entry from March 1793 notes, "Third blade shows signs of wear after 18 executions. Edge requires additional honing with Belgian whetstones." The family developed their own specialized mixture of oils and abrasives for maintaining the blade's edge, a precise combination of rendered whale oil, fine-ground pumice, and a mysterious third ingredient that Charles Henri referred to only as la poudre rouge in his notes. This formula was so closely guarded that when Henri's younger brother Gabriel attempted to sell it to a rival executioner in Lyon in 1791, he was temporarily disowned from the family. According to Antoine Louis, the chief surgeon who helped design the guillotine, the Sansons blade maintenance regime produced the cleanest wounds I've ever examined in my medical career. The guillotine's frame required equal attention. Each morning, starting at precisely 5:15 a.m. according to Henry's logbooks, the moving parts were oiled with a specific mixture of rendered animal fat and graphite powder sourced from a specialist merchant in the Rue Saint-Denis. The grooves in which the blade fell, measured at exactly 8.4 centimeters wide, had to be perfectly clean and aligned. Even the slightest deviation, as little as 2 millimeters, according to Charles Henry's calculations, could result in a horrifically botched execution. The release mechanism, designed by Antoine Louis and improved upon by the Sansons, underwent at least 15 modifications between 1792 and 1794 alone. The famous revolutionary journalist Camille Desmoulins, before his own execution in 1794, remarked with dark humor, "The Sansons maintain their machine better than the Committee of Public Safety maintains the Republic." During the height of the Terror, this maintenance routine became even more critical. At the peak of the Terror, between June 10th and July 27th, 1794, the period known as the Great Terror, the machine might be called upon to execute dozens of people in a single day. On June 17th, 1794, at the Place du Trône Renverse, now Place de la Nation, the grim record of 54 executions in just under 3 hours was set, averaging one death every 3 minutes and 20 seconds. The Sansons developed a system of rotating multiple blades throughout the day, keeping 3 sharpened ones ready at all times in a specially designed wooden case lined with felt and leather. Their team of assistants, including the notorious Jean-François de Moraes, who had previously worked as a butcher, operated in 3 shifts of 8 hours each. The logistics of mass executions presented unprecedented challenges that transformed the Place de la Révolution into what one observer, the English tourist John Moore, called a factory of death. The scaffold, originally designed to handle no more than 10 executions per day, had to be reinforced with additional oak beams sourced from the Fontainebleau forest. A complex system of pulleys and levers, designed by engineer Jean-Nicolas Goujon, was installed to help move bodies efficiently. The sawdust spread around the scaffold, typically 50 pounds per day during normal times, increased to over 300 pounds daily during the height of the Terror. A municipal health report from July 1794 noted that the smell of blood became so pervasive that residents as far as the Rue Saint-Honoré, some 200 meters away, complained of the stench. The famous parfumier Jean-Louis Fargeon was eventually commissioned to develop a special mixture of lime and lavender to mask the odor. The disposal of bodies presented a logistical nightmare that required military-level organization. The Sansons worked with a network of 17 gravediggers led by the veteran François Doge at the Cimetière des Errancis and Picpus Cemetery. During peak periods, they employed 8 horse-drawn carts, each capable of carrying 6 to 8 bodies, operated by the Flamand family's transport company. A surviving receipt from July 1794 shows a payment of 1,200 livres for a single month's cartage services. The innovative use of quicklime, suggested by the chemist Antoine Lavoisier, ironically before his own execution, required approximately 100 pounds per dozen bodies. Henry Sanson's records, kept in a leather-bound ledger now housed in the Carnavalet Museum, show that between 1793 and 1794 alone, they processed 2,831 bodies, requiring over 12 tons of quicklime. Despite their expertise, even the Sansons couldn't prevent every mishap. The Charlotte Corday incident of July 17, 1793, became particularly notorious. After her execution for assassinating Marat, assistant François Legros' impulsive slap of her severed head created a sensation when witnesses reported seeing her face blush and her eyes glare with indignation. This incident sparked intense scientific debate, leading Dr. Jean-Joseph Sue to publish his influential study, Research on Physical Life, which examined consciousness after decapitation. The renowned Dr. Georges Cabanis conducted experiments on severed heads, noting that facial movements could continue for up to 15 minutes post-mortem. The case of Henri Desrues in April 1777 represented one of the most horrific pre-guillotine execution failures. When the rope broke during his hanging at the Place de Grève, Desrues fell 7 feet, breaking his ankle but surviving. The second attempt, using a reinforced rope from the naval supplies store on Rue Saint-Denis, succeeded, but the incident haunted Charles Henri. In his private correspondence with Dr. Antoine Louis, dated 1784, he wrote, "The hanging of Desrues remains my greatest professional shame. No man should die twice." This incident would later be cited in Dr. Guillotine's famous speech to the National Assembly on December 1, 1789, advocating for mechanical execution methods. Female executions presented unique challenges that required special protocols. The execution of Madame du Barry, Louis XV's former mistress, on December 8, 1793, proved particularly problematic. Her hysterical resistance, famously crying, "Encore un moment, Monsieur le Bourreau," "One more moment, Mr. Executioner," led to the development of specific restraint techniques. The Sansons designed a modified leather strap system with additional restraints at the waist and shoulders, costing 120 livres per set. They also instituted a policy of having a female assistant, Marie-Louise Giraud, present for women's executions to help maintain dignity during final preparations. Technical failures, though rare, had devastating consequences. On February 23, 1794, a poorly maintained blade jammed halfway through the execution of a counter-revolutionary named Jean-Baptiste Lécuyer at the Place de la Révolution. The horrific scene, witnessed by hundreds including the painter Jacques-Louis David, required manual completion with an axe. This incident led Charles Henri to institute the Protocol of 10. The blade would be dropped 10 times before each day's executions, with exact measurements taken of the drop speed using a pendulum chronometer borrowed from the Academy of Sciences. The Sansons' handling of Nicolas Jacques Pelletier's execution, the first by guillotine on April 25, 1792, demonstrated their ability to adapt to unexpected challenges. Pelletier, standing at 6'4", exceeded the machine's original specifications by nearly 5 inches. Charles Henri and his team worked through the night to modify the frame height, adding a custom-built oak extension that would later become a standard feature. The execution drew a crowd of over 20,000 people, including Dr. Guillotin himself, who reportedly turned pale and left before the blade fell. The revolutionary journalist Louis-Marie Prudhomme wrote, "The crowd seemed disappointed by the brevity of the spectacle, having been accustomed to the prolonged theatre of hanging." The execution of Louis XVI on January 21, 1793, presented unprecedented security and technical challenges. The Sansons had to contend with both royalist sympathizers and souvenir hunters. They developed a special mixture of sawdust and lime, dyed dark brown with walnut husks to disguise the royal blood. Charles Henri's son Henri recorded in his diary that they positioned 4 assistants with rakes to immediately cover any blood spots. Despite these precautions, several handkerchiefs were dipped in the king's blood, one of which was later sold at auction in 1876 for 10,000 francs. The execution required special modifications to the bascule, the tilting board, to accommodate the king's unusual girth, modifications that cost 123 livres and were detailed in a receipt still preserved in the Archives Nationales. By 1796, the Sansons had refined their process to achieve remarkable efficiency. Working with a team of 4 assistants, they could complete an execution in precisely 21 seconds from the moment the condemned mounted the scaffold, a fact verified by multiple independent observers using pocket chronometers. During the execution of the poet André Chénier on July 25, 1794, witnesses noted that barely 2 minutes elapsed between his arrival in the tumbril and his death. The architect Charles Percier, who observed several executions while designing the Place de la Révolution's layout, wrote that the Sansons moved with the precision of a theatrical production and the gravity of a religious ceremony. The tools and methods of the Sanson family represented a unique intersection of Enlightenment precision and revolutionary brutality. Their workshop at 3 Rue de la Ferronnerie contained an impressive array of specialized equipment, 6 different types of sharpening stones imported from Turkey and Belgium, a collection of more than 30 measuring devices including calipers accurate to within 0.5 millimeters, and a library of anatomical texts that rivaled those of many medical schools. The famous scientist Antoine Lavoisier, before his own execution in 1794, noted with grim irony that the Sansons bring scientific precision to the art of ending scientific inquiry. Their professional legacy extended beyond France. Between 1792 and 1800, the Sansons received visits from executioners from Prussia, Spain, and several Italian states, all seeking to learn their methods. The detailed instructions they provided to Bavaria's chief executioner, Johann Paul Reichhardt, in 1798, resulted in the adoption of similar techniques throughout German territories. A Spanish document from 1799, preserved in Madrid's National Archives, references the méthode Sanson as the gold standard for mechanical execution. The psychological toll of their profession became evident in private correspondence. In a letter to his wife, dated August 1794, Henri Sanson wrote, "Each morning I wash blood from my hands like Pontius Pilate, yet unlike him, I cannot absolve myself of responsibility." Charles Henri's personal diary, discovered in 1892, revealed that he kept meticulous count of his executions, 2,918 in total, and would reportedly wake in the night calculating blade trajectories and fall velocities. The Sanson family's methods transformed execution from a public spectacle into a grimly efficient process. Their work embodied the paradox of the Age of Reason, using scientific precision and enlightened principles to perfect the machinery of death. As Maximilien Robespierre himself observed shortly before becoming a victim of the system he helped create, the Sansons have made death as swift as a thunderbolt and as methodical as a clock. This observation would prove darkly prophetic. When Robespierre faced the guillotine on July 28, 1794, Charles-Henri Sanson ensured that his execution took exactly 21 seconds, timed by multiple witnesses. The final drop. How the Sansons ended France's monarchy. In the grey dawn of January 21, 1793, Charles-Henri Sanson faced what would become the most politically charged execution of his career. As France's 4th-generation executioner approached Louis XVI in the Temple prison, the deposed king reportedly asked, "Is it you, Monsieur Sanson?" To which he replied with professional courtesy, "Yes, sire." This exchange, documented in Henri's memoirs, marked a surreal moment where centuries of divine monarchy met their end at the hands of a family who had served the crown for generations. The Sansons had held the position of royal executioner since 1688, when Charles Sanson I received his appointment from Louis XIV, an ironic historical thread that would culminate in his great-grandson executing Louis XVI's descendant. The execution of Louis XVI tested the Sansons' technical expertise and diplomatic skills in unprecedented ways. The king, standing 5 and 9 inches and weighing approximately 200 pounds, required special modifications to the guillotine's bascule. When Louis arrived at the Place de la Révolution, he attempted to address the crowd of 20,000 spectators. The drums ordered by General Santerre drowned out his words, but Charles-Henri recorded them in his journal. "I die innocent of all the crimes laid to my charge. I pardon those who have occasioned my death, and I pray to God that the blood you are going to shed may never be visited on France." The execution took place at 10:22 a.m. precisely, timed by multiple witnesses, including the young painter Jacques-Louis David, who made several sketches of the scene that now reside in the Louvre. The execution itself lasted 21 seconds from the moment Louis mounted the scaffold. Charles Henri preserved the king's hair in a leather pouch. later sold at auction in 1815 for 5,000 francs. Witnesses reported that he and his assistants worked with such swift precision that many in the crowd missed the actual moment of death, leading the radical journalist Jacques Hébert to praise their republican efficiency. The executioner's team included his son Henri, his brother-in-law François-Joseph Desmorais, and 4 assistants who had trained specifically for this historic event. They had rehearsed the procedure multiple times the previous night using weighted sacks, as recorded in the workshop logbook still preserved in the Carnavalet Museum. 9 months later, on October 16, 1793, Marie Antoinette's execution presented different challenges. The Queen, described in Henri Sanson's notes as dignified to the last, had aged considerably during her imprisonment in the conciergerie. Her hair had turned completely white, which she had cut herself the night before. Unlike her husband, she maintained regal composure throughout the proceedings. When she accidentally stepped on Charles Henri's foot while mounting the scaffold, she reportedly said, "Pardon, monsieur, I did not mean to do it." The execution occurred at 12:15 p.m., witnessed by painter Jacques-Louis David, who captured her final journey in his famous sketch, Marie Antoinette on the way to the guillotine. The Queen's last words, recorded by multiple sources including the revolutionary newspaper Le Moniteur Universel, were, "Farewell, my children, I go to join your father." The Sansons' duties extended beyond the royal executions. During the height of the Terror, June 1793 to July 1794, they performed up to 300 executions per month, requiring them to maintain 3 separate guillotines in Paris, at the Place de la Révolution, Place de Grève, and Place du Trône Renversé. Notable cases included Charlotte Corday, who had assassinated Marat in his bathtub on July 13, 1793, and Madame du Barry, whose desperate cries for mercy, "Encore un moment, Monsieur le Bourreau," so affected the typically stoic Charles Henri that he mentioned it specifically in his diary, "Never have I suffered more in my duties than today." The execution of the chemist Antoine Lavoisier on May 8, 1794, prompted the mathematician Joseph-Louis Lagrange to remark, "It took them only an instant to cut off that head, and 100 years may not produce another like it." The public's reaction to these executions evolved over time. While early revolutionary executions drew massive crowds, the Place de la Révolution often held 30,000 to 40,000 spectators. By late 1794, attendance had dwindled significantly. Market women, known as tricoteuses, would sit knitting by the guillotine, counting the falls of the blade like stitches. The most famous of these women, Marie Antoinette Knoll, kept a macabre diary, recording 2,746 executions she had witnessed. Children played games mimicking the executions, leading one observer, the English diarist Grace Elliot, to note, "The Sansons have made death so common that it has ceased to horrify." Local cafes near the execution sites, particularly the Café de la Guillotine on Rue Saint-Honoré, served drinks with names like Republican Red and Sangre de Louis, drawing criticism from even revolutionary hardliners like Saint-Just. The family's professionalism never wavered, despite the psychological toll. Charles Henri maintained detailed records of each execution, including weather conditions, blade maintenance, and victim behavior. His leather-bound ledger, now in the Archives Nationales, reveals meticulous attention to detail, even recording the exact number of steps, 73, from the prison cart to the scaffold. His son Henri later wrote, "We served justice, not vengeance," though private letters reveal their growing discomfort with the escalating bloodshed. After executing Georges Danton on April 5, 1794, Charles Henri recorded the revolutionary leader's prophetic last words, "Show my head to the people. It is worth seeing." The execution of Camille Desmoulins the same day particularly affected Henri, who had attended the same school as the revolutionary journalist. In his memoir, Henri noted that Desmoulins died clutching a lock of his wife's hair. Perhaps the most dramatic sequence came during the fall of Robespierre. On July 28, 1794, the Sansons executed 22 of his supporters, including Robespierre himself. The previous day's failed attempt to take his own life had shattered Maximilien Robespierre's jaw, requiring special handling during his execution. Charles Henri's report notes that when the bandage was removed from Robespierre's face, he emitted a scream of such terrible pain that it was heard across the entire Place de la Révolution. The execution effectively ended the terror, though the Sansons would continue their duties for another generation. The family's account books show they charged the convention 500 livres for this day's work, more than usual due to the complex logistics of handling so many high-profile executions in quick succession. Among those executed with Robespierre was Louis de Saint-Just, who maintained such composure that Charles Henri later described him as dying like an ancient Roman. Their involvement in these historic executions transformed the Sanson family from mere functionaries into reluctant celebrities. They received visitors from across Europe seeking details of their famous victims' final moments. The German writer Johann Wolfgang von Goethe attempted to interview Charles Henri in 1795, but was politely refused. The executioner's workshop at 9 Rue des Marais became an unofficial museum of sorts, with Charles Henri preserving various artifacts, including the special axe used for noble executions before the guillotine's adoption. He repeatedly refused large sums offered for Louis XVI's blade, stating in a letter to the convention that some things must remain beyond price. When asked years later about the king's execution by the historian Augustin Chalamel, he would only say, "I served the nation as I served the king, with the same dedication to a swift and painless death." The revolutionary period left an indelible mark on the family. Henry Sanson, who assisted his father throughout this period and succeeded him in 1795, noted that the rhythm of the terror had forever altered their profession. Before, we were executioners who occasionally worked. During the terror, we became workers who occasionally slept. This transformation from occasional executioners to managers of industrial-scale death marked not only the family's history, but also the revolution's descent from idealistic reform to systematic violence. The family's records show they executed 2,918 people during the terror alone, requiring the maintenance of 23 blades and employment of 17 full-time assistants. The famous artist, Francisco Goya, who visited Paris in 1799, captured this industrialization of death in his sketch, The Sleep of Reason Produces Monsters, supposedly inspired by conversations with Henry Sanson about the terror's psychological impact on its practitioners. The last cut, the fall of France's executioner dynasty. The Sanson family's grip on France's apparatus of death began in 1688 when Charles Sanson I received his royal appointment under Louis XIV, establishing a dynasty that would span 6 generations and witness France's transformation from absolute monarchy to modern republic. The family's training methods were extraordinarily rigorous. From age 7, Sanson children began their education in anatomy, studying with medical students at the Sorbonne under assumed names. Charles-Henri Sanson, who would later execute Louis XVI, recalled in his memoirs practicing blade techniques on cabbages and melons by age 12, graduating to sheep and calves by 14. His father, Charles Jean-Baptiste, insisted he master the complex physics of the sword before touching a guillotine, believing that understanding the elegant violence of noble executions would instill both precision and gravity in his heir. Young Charles-Henri trained under the renowned swordmaster Guillaume d'Annet, who wrote in 1766 that the boy handles a blade as if death were a form of mathematics. The family maintained a private library of over 700 volumes on anatomy, physics, and engineering, including rare texts from the Arab world on blade metallurgy. Their decline began subtly during the Restoration period, 1814 to 1830. Henri Clement Sanson, Charles Henri's grandson, inherited the position in 1840 but lacked his predecessor's financial acumen. While previous generations had supplemented their official salary of 10,000 francs with careful investments, including profitable shares in the Compagnie des Indes Orientales, Henri Clément developed expensive habits. His passion for gambling and fine wines led him to sell family heirlooms, including the leather-bound execution journals of his grandfather, which were purchased by the Bibliothèque Nationale for 3,000 francs in 1842. His losses at the notorious Palais Royal gaming houses reached 50,000 francs by 1845, nearly 5 times his annual salary. The family's fortunes suffered a decisive blow in 1847 when Henri Clément's debts forced him to sell their ancestral home at Nîmes Rue des Marais, where 6 generations of Sansons had lived and maintained their workshop. The building, with its specialized execution equipment and historical artifacts, was purchased by wealthy collector Alexandre Dumas Fils for 75,000 francs, who later donated the contents to the Carnavalet Museum. Among the items sold was the measuring rod used to size Louis XVI for the guillotine, which fetched 1,200 francs at auction. The workshop's infamous Black Cabinet, a room containing execution records dating to 1688, yielded documents now considered priceless, including Marie Antoinette's last letter to Madame Elizabeth and a lock of Charlotte Corday's hair. The modernization of France's penal system further eroded the family's prominence. The law of 1832, abolishing public executions in smaller towns, reduced their income significantly, as they could no longer charge travel expenses and per diems for provincial work. Previously, a single execution in Marseille could earn them up to 3,000 francs in expenses alone. The novelist Victor Hugo, who interviewed Henri Clément in 1848 at the Café Procope, noted that the once proud executioner carried himself like a businessman facing bankruptcy, rather than the heir to a terrible tradition. In his notes, Hugo recorded that Henri Clément's hands shook so badly he could barely hold his coffee cup, a stark contrast to the surgical precision his grandfather had been famous for. Technology also played a role in their downfall. The introduction of the winch for raising the guillotine blade in 1870 eliminated the need for skilled assistants, many of whom had been Sanson relatives employed at family wages. The mechanical innovation, designed by engineer Antoine-Louis Foucault, while more efficient, removed much of the theatrical element that had made the Sansons masters of their craft. The family had employed up to 12 assistants during the 1820s, including 4 cousins who specialized in crowd control and 3 brothers-in-law who maintained the complex rope and pulley systems. As one contemporary journalist, from Le Figaro, observed, "The guillotine has become a machine that any mechanic could operate, no longer requiring the hereditary touch of a Sanson." The final blow came with the Third Republic's bureaucratization of the execution office. In 1874, the position was open to public competition rather than hereditary succession. The last Sanson to apply, Henri Clément's son Georges-Henri, failed the newly instituted technical examination despite his family's centuries of practical experience. The position went to Louis Dible, whose family would dominate the role until the guillotine's abolition in 1981. The exam, designed by the Ministry of Justice, emphasized modern mechanical knowledge over traditional skills. Georges-Henri scored particularly poorly on the section regarding the new hydraulic systems, leading the examining committee to note that he seemed trapped in methods better suited to the previous century. The Sansons' exit from their hereditary profession coincided with broader social changes in French society. The rise of scientific rationalism diminished the mystique surrounding the executioner's role, while growing opposition to capital punishment reduced public appetite for hereditary death dealers. The family's attempts to maintain their social position through marriage alliances failed as their name became increasingly associated with an anachronistic and barbaric tradition. Georges-Henri's daughter, Marie, was rejected by 3 prospective suitors' families in 1875 alone, despite her considerable education and a dowry of 20,000 francs. By 1889, when the last known Sanson descendant died in poverty at the Hôtel Dieu Hospital, the family's fall was complete. Marie-Antoine Sanson, great-great-granddaughter of Charles Henri, passed away in Ward 23, recorded simply as seamstress. Their extensive library of execution manuals, anatomical studies, and personal correspondence was dispersed among various collectors and institutions. The Bibliothèque de l'Arsenal acquired 147 volumes of their technical manuscripts for a mere 500 francs, while their prized first edition of Andreas Vesalius's De Humani Corpori Fabrica, used for generations to study anatomy, was sold to an American collector for 3,000 francs. The final ledger entry in their family records, written in a shaky hand by Marie-Antoine, reads simply, "The blade falls for the last time." The Sanson dynasty's decline paralleled France's complicated relationship with capital punishment. As execution methods became more clinical and bureaucratic, the need for hereditary executioners who combined technical skill with ceremonial gravity disappeared. The family that had once commanded respect as the dignified agents of royal and revolutionary justice found themselves obsolete in a world that preferred its violence administered by anonymous civil servants rather than theatrical specialists. By 1870, the new state executioner earned just 6,000 francs annually, less than half what Charles Henri had earned in 1789, and was required to submit detailed expense reports for even minor equipment repairs. The fall of the Sanson dynasty marked the end of an era when capital punishment was considered both an art and a family tradition. Their decline reflected France's transition from the personal justice of the Ancien Régime to the mechanical efficiency of the modern state. The last public execution in Paris, conducted by the Deibler family in 1939, bore little resemblance to the carefully choreographed ceremonies the Sansons had orchestrated. Where Charles Henri had insisted on testing blade sharpness with a feather and measuring neck thickness to the millimeter, the new state executioners relied on standardized equipment and procedures. In their passing, something was lost, not just a family tradition, but a complex understanding of death as both ceremony and science, a perspective unique to those who had made execution their hereditary craft. The famous writer Alphonse de Lamartine, who had witnessed both Sanson and post-Sanson executions, remarked in 1851, "Under the Sansons, death had dignity. Under the state, it has mere efficiency." The family's personal effects, sold at various auctions between 1847 and 1890, now reside in museums across Europe. Silent testimonies to a time when even death required its nobility. The executioner's sword, used for aristocratic beheadings before the Revolution, last wielded by Charles Henry Sanson, hangs in the Musée Carnavalet, its blade still bearing the Latin inscription Ultima Ratio Regum, the final argument of kings. As we delve into the shadows of history, the Sanson family's legacy remains etched in the dark corners of French memory. 6 generations who turned execution into an art form. Through revolution and restoration, they maintained their grim ballet with death, executing over 3,000 souls, including a king, a queen, and countless revolutionaries who themselves would later mount the scaffold. Perhaps Honoré de Balzac captured their essence best when he wrote in 1847, "The Sansons were not mere executioners. They were the high priests of a terrible ceremony, passing down their dark sacrament from father to son." Their story reminds us that even in death there was once ceremony, dignity, and a family who believed that if life must be taken, it should be taken well. As the last light fades on their story, we're left with Charles Henri's haunting words to his son. "Remember, we don't take lives, we release souls. The difference lies in how we do it. Until next time, let the blade of history rest. Goodbye."